Okay, I'll introduce myself. I guess most of you know me by now. We're very pleased to have Dr. Gächter here. And I'm going to be asking him a bunch of questions, some of which are follow-up to his talk and his paper that he was referring to. Some of them are a little more speculative. And shall we get going right away? So the first thing we'd like to ask is, what are we actually explaining when we talk about cooperation? And when we look at cooperation, we see that it refers to many different behaviors. It can be monetary contributions in an economic game, or following the rules, or just all kinds of rules that may come up in the morality as cooperation approaches, and could even be, in general, conflict avoidance, social harmony, and maybe as a devil's advocate, I may say sometimes cooperation can even be immoral. We can define that. So, should we consider all these different behaviors as expressions of a single underlying phenomenon? In other words, does cooperation actually cover all these different kinds of behavior? Or are they somehow related, but they're distinct from one another? And is that common thread actually cooperation? There's a follow-up to that. I don't know if you rather hear it first.
Okay.
So I guess the follow-up is to say, is it conceptually legitimate to reduce morality to cooperation? Because defining cooperation is one thing, but a great deal of the moral behavior and morality literature in general presumes that cooperation can be taken as the ideal form, let's say, of morality. And is this really legitimate? Or are we trying to collapse a much richer system into a single concept, the concept of cooperation?
I think that's, of course, a very deep question and a very big one. So, and I don't know whether I can answer this comprehensively now in a few minutes. I think these things, the way I see cooperation, maybe this is my economist hat on, is there is some tangible benefit, whatever that is. It's not in some situations when we talk about the climate, we all benefit from a climate, because from a healthy, good climate. But it might not be in my personal interest. So it's something we talk about, the tension between what I am interested in narrowly for myself and what's good for a collective. This collective can be a diet, couple, can be a family, can be a workplace, can be up to the world, climate. So, of course, now the exact details of how the incentives are structured in such interactions, they differ. But at least from that, when we talk about, when we don't have something shared that we more or less call it's in our collective joint interest, then we talk about something different than cooperation. So we take it for granted, let's say, at least in many cases, that we all benefit, most clearly from a climate that's not broken down, because life might not be sustainable or very hard to sustain if there is no. So in that sense, we have a shared interest. But that doesn't mean that I don't have an interest personally to don't care about it, because my impact on it is small and so on. So and the same is, I might want to have a stable partnership but I might be tempted to abuse it and my privileges in there. So that's how I see cooperation. This has many different facets, but if you break it down, there is always at some level a tension between what's good for the group, whatever. This can be a couple only, a pair, or up to the entire planet. So somewhere there is a tension between self-interest, what's good for the collective broadly conceived. So now, how do people perceive these incentives? That's now a different story. Sometimes, that's one of the things that, let's say, the econ games that we study, when we study cooperation using these games, we are imposing an incentive structure that has the feature of these dilemma problems. So now in experiments that I showed today and what we heard here in these experiments, that's the beauty of these experiments. As we control this incentive structure, we know that people play, conceptually speaking, a social dilemma problem. Do people perceive it like that? That's a very good question. Even harder question is, do people perceive real-world cooperation problems as cooperation problems or as something else? Yeah, so there is the distinction that we make conceptually, I think, between how we model a problem. That's what the first part of my answer was. And the second dimension is, how do people perceive it like that? Of course, the justification, if I don't care about something, suppose, if a partnership breaks down, it's sometimes because we don't care about sharing a future together any longer. Then the situation has changed from that perspective. So I think this is a very partial question here. So morality here, I think if you look at the way I understand the morality as cooperation, is that these are all the problems that morality is supposed to solve are all problems of cooperation in some sort. If we can formulate it like that, in that sense, I found it, when I first heard this, I found it quite convincing that morality is related to how we regulate our joint affairs. So, if morality would not be needed if we were only singletons. So, but we are not the singletons, that we are individuals that depend on each other to survive. That's a form of cooperation. We would not be able to live alone. So that's how we have evolved, I think, and maybe the emotions that are attached to this, and the thinking and the feeling and the embarrassment and all that social emotions that we have. If we violate some of those rules that sustain cooperation, that are expression of morality, the moral emotions that we have, they are there for a reason. That's because we depend on each other at a very fundamental level. I think this is why, I'm a bit hand-wavy now, but that's sort of the thinking behind it. Cooperation is absolutely fundamental. Sometimes cooperation problems are easy in the sense that it's in our mutual interest, and we have, in terms of my framework, the incentives are strong enough to sustain some level of cooperation out of pure incentives. So in game theoretic terms, this would be games with cooperative equilibrium, so where cooperation is an equilibrium in some equilibrium. So that, but it's still cooperation. There are always, many times, situations. So the problem of cooperation is because non-cooperation is always an equilibrium too. Meaning, if I know that you are not cooperating, my best response from this perspective is also not to cooperate. That's always an equilibrium. So cooperation is always a hard problem. It's never a solved problem, because you can always deviate to the bad situation. So I think, to cut a long-winded answer short, I think the way I think we need to define cooperation is, what is our shared interest, collective interest, and what is my self-interest, and are they aligned or not? So maybe that answers partly.
Thank you very much. Nobody can disagree, I think, with what you said, but maybe we can find some exceptions, and particularly when we're talking about groups versus larger groups, or groups with which we don't actually have a codependent relationship, and well, I mean, probably there are many ways to look for details.
Yes. Okay, so I want to add something before I answer that. That was about, is cooperation always good? No, it's not. Yeah. So that's cooperation can be to very bad ends. Yeah, bad people cooperate often. I mean, effectively enough to each other to, yeah. So I mean, obviously, the Holocaust, everything was a solved cooperation problem in the sense that the machinery was set up to do something terribly bad. Yeah, and some of the things that are happening now, yeah, in the world are the result of quite effective cooperation with a very bad end. So, I mean, that's, you know, or from an econ perspective, you know, collusion among firms is something that's cooperative outcome. So we do price fixing, but it's at the detriment of consumers. So for society overall, it's bad. So it's whether cooperation is a good thing or not, it depends very much on the exact situation that we have. So these experiments today, or this research today, or everything we have heard here presupposes that cooperation is a good thing, but it doesn't have to be. The logic of studying it, however, I think is probably very similar.
Well, we might even ask whether morality is always a good thing.
Okay.
But no, let's not go there. That's too speculative, and it's away from our main task, I think.
I think it can be that morality is some aspects of it. You know, if I'm too loyal, you know, people are too loyal to, maybe if I may say this, to Donald Trump now, or to Putin, or some other people. You know, loyalty there, again, it's cooperation between two people or some people at the detriment of others. So that came, in that sense, you know, things like,
well, very bad things like war,
yeah,
encourage people to be very cooperative.
That's true too. So and also to encourage people to do terrible atrocities.
Yes.
Yeah, to each other and to others. So yeah. So I think it's. I mean, okay. So in that sense, you know, my definition sounded of cooperation. You know, you have to have the caveat that what is the common benefit is actually, you know, the price fixers or the warmongers or whoever. Yeah, can be at the benefit, can be at the detriment of other people. So
right,
for whom? The same thing. For whom? Yes, exactly. That's of course important caveat to the whole thing. But it doesn't change the logic of it. You can still study the logic of this type of cooperation. Yeah, whether people would take that into account, to what, you know, that they are doing harm to some other people, some other groups of people.
Well, that's what makes behavioral economics possible.
Yes,
that there is such a logic which can be
followed
exactly. And manipulated. I want to change the focus of our discussion, though, to another place, which is you have presented very, very solid evidence that cooperation is maybe largely explained by rule following. And so that brings up the question of what is rule following, actually. If it's not morality, I mean, people do talk about moral rules all the time, at least religious people and pseudo-religious people do. You've shown that people follow rules even when enforcement is weak or absent, that compliance is costly, but they still follow rules. So I'm wondering whether cooperation is best understood as a norm-dependent phenomenon, or is it a more general mechanism that enables multiple systems? Because when you think about it, morality, yes, is very rule dependent. Okay, cooperation is rule dependent. Simply the operation of institutions relies greatly on rules, our ability to speak to one another, our communication depends on the rules of grammar.
Yes.
Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to understand one another. And that's not a moral problem. And it's not exactly a cooperation problem either. And there must be many areas of life that are rule dependent. So what are rules? Where do they come from? What kind of mental underpinning do they have?
I think actually that's the reason why I think what you just said is all, I agree with everything, that the rules are much more fundamental, are really fundamental for human social behavior, and surprisingly understudied about what they do and how they look like and what, I mean, in practice it seems like at least at the moment, the way I think about it is, I haven't thought about this unlike for about other things, this is a relatively recent interest of mine. Actually started during the pandemic when all the rules were issued. They were very clear: stay at home and wash hands and get vaccinated and wear a mask and stuff. So these are very clear rules. What for? Yeah, to contain the pandemic. So, but then I thought, this is actually, the phenomenon is much more fundamental than that. These are just some vivid and clear examples, and you gave just some. I mean, communication is also a cooperative endeavor, of course. If we want to cooperate, we need to understand each other. If we want to communicate, we need to understand each other. So we have to follow some rules of communication. But okay, so it's still a good question. So to what extent that's cooperation or not? I think rule following is more general than cooperation. But to cooperate in practice often means following the rules. Yeah, the reason for this is that cooperation problems are typically much more complicated than the ones that we study using laboratory games. I mean, they are very simplified type of tools. But in practice, to maintain a space like this, for instance, we obeyed all some rules of how we behave here. Yeah? I mean, some of these rules we know and they're socialized into, but other rules need to be told. I mean, this summer I went to a swimming pool, and fortunately I couldn't take a picture there, but there was a board with a lot of these pictorial signs what you're allowed to do here or not. And so about 20 or something. So this is just to govern a swimming pool. Yeah? So, but the way you have to dress, what you can do, what you can play, what you're allowed. I don't know. There are lots of different subcomponents to this, and I think that's just practically that you have to formulate rules about what to do, and the same is true for lots of moral behaviors. From the Ten Commandments downwards, and prior to the Ten Commandments, social behavior was regulated by rules that some people issued, hopefully to some extent at least, to solve some common interests. Yeah, and I think this is why I think studying cooperation and rule following is intimately linked, but it hasn't. Maybe, I don't know, people haven't done it so far as I can tell. Yeah. Rule following as such, as a separate object of study, is a relatively new topic, I would say, it seems to me. So implicitly not, but implicitly people have argued like we are arguing now, but in terms of an object, okay, here's a rule, how do you study it? It's also, I got inspired by a book by a historian called Lauren Daston. She wrote The Rules We Live By, I think is the title of the book or something. And that book is interesting because a historical account about rules and how rules are formulated across various different spheres of life. And it's a very generic phenomenon. Yeah, it includes things that you mentioned, and it's not just necessarily about social things from her perspective, but so I think it should be studied more. Of course, as a behavioral economist, scientist, I'm interested in the behavioral aspects of why people do stuff. This is why, when I was also dissatisfied, but there are so many different channels and explanations out there, but no unification. So here's my little attempt to some unification of behavioral motives to study this phenomenon.
Well, as it should be, of course, it's complex, since you have all these different variables operating at the same time. Most of the research in this area is now quantitative. And a lot of it is about answering questionnaires and scales and stuff like that. And a lot of it is about these laboratory, especially games, but other kinds of situations. But would it be useful in the study of morality to take the phenomenology of moral decision-making seriously? It's much more difficult to quantify, of course.
Yes, so I think my goal of this was not to have another lab experiment and another, so the point of this two projects that I talked about today is that we can study a phenomenon in a way that is, at least for conceptual purposes here, completely comparable. Whereas previously, the one problem from my perspective is that in previous literature, all of these effects were talked about, but they were not made comparable. So that's the first step. So we have a framework that works in the sense that even in the most asocial, simplest task you can think of, all four elements that I mentioned, unconditional rule following, extrinsic incentives, social expectations, and social preferences affect behavior. So therefore, we now have a toolbox, a conceptual toolbox. That's the more important thing, to think about these problems. And I completely agree with you. It should not, if this is only restricted to lab stuff, it has probably failed its purpose in the long run. I think it's exactly interesting to step out of this, using tools that are now available, with large language models and other things, for instance, to use more qualitative data to still do quantitative stuff. We analyze things. But I don't know. We can think of combination of behavior and combination of qualitative data, but under a conceptual lens. That's how I see CRISP is a conceptual lens to me. So about what type of phenomena do I expect to see? In an experiment, I make it very simple, but the logic of it, I do what other people do, or I don't care about other people. I have my own moral principles. I care about how other people are affected by my behavior. Or I just conformist. I go with the flow. So these are all motivations that are very general human propensities, and that's what we just shown in a simple experiment. But the phenomenon is much larger, and therefore I think this is. But to make progress in that type of things, you need also a conceptual lens, and at least I think that. So so then we can combine qualitative studies with that don't wander off in some incomprehensible directions.
They might help to formalize, I think, our intuitions. A lot of our ideas, like ideas about incentives and information about what other people do and how that influences. We as researchers look to ourselves and say, what affects me?
Yes.
Perhaps, these are the sort of outward manifestations of those kinds of things. But I want to ask a more general question, which I think especially Yilmaz would like to hear. How should psychology and economics, which look at the same phenomena with basically different vocabularies, I think, divide the explanatory labor in cooperation research?
Okay, so
divide or maybe integrate. I don't know.
I say I'm all for integration. So to the extent that's possible. So I can tell you. I have no fully formed answer to this because. Obviously, I read a lot of. Step number one is reading other people's papers. So outside of your own discipline and other journals, and try to publish in other journals. outside of your discipline, it's the first step, because that helps you think about putting yourself in the shoes of another discipline and their perspective. Obviously, I've tried to do that for my entire career. That's one thing. The other thing is what psychologists are clearly better at than economists is going to the psychological mechanisms that produce this. If you read my rule following paper, it's not about that. It's all behavioral expressions of these principles. It doesn't tell you what are the psychological underpinning mechanisms for that. And I think that's what psychologists can clearly do better than economists. Of course, it helps to talk to each other and to find the common methodology and stuff, but I think that's where I probably see the main division of labor. So I see it seems that in economists have a good. I think economists understand incentives quite well, but what they don't understand is incentives narrowly conceived, meaning what my material costs and benefits are. Yeah. So I think that because all of economics was built on analyzing the consequences of incentives. I mean, it's like 30, 40, 50 years of research on that. I think we understand that. What we do not understand well in economics is the interaction with these other obvious factors that people also are motivated with, like most likely this unconditional type of behavior that is not motivated by incentives so directly, or also conformism. Although their research has started in economics too. But again, it's like the idea, okay, people are motivated to comply with some norms. Why exactly, we don't know. But I think there, what are the psychological mechanisms why people want to do the normative thing? Is it just because they internalize it, or because they have fear of punishment? And I don't know. It's like separating these type of incentives from each other is what I think economists are good at. And the psychological mechanisms that produce these things a bit, so because I got the good, when I published this paper in Nature Human Behavior, one of the comments was we used the terminology psychological mechanism in the first version. I got pushback on it, saying you're not talking about psychological mechanism, you talk about behavior. So therefore we've purged the manuscript from psychological mechanisms. It's behavioral expressions of stuff. And I say, it's not exactly the same thing. So I don't look into people's brain yet. So we just see what they do, in various situations, and then we have an interpretation about this. But
just to add another layer of complication to this integration process, cultures are different from one another, which means that their rules to some extent, or at least the hierarchy of rules within cultures, can be different from one another. And not only that, individuals are irredeemably different from one another. And so, what do we do with all this variation?
Yeah, so again, I think my interest is in first of all, to understand the variety. So I have another paper that I didn't talk about today, but it speaks to this. And this is where we did the public goods game that I talked about today. With and without punishment in 43 different countries. And what did we find? That behavior was very similar without punishment. Cooperation broke down. We repeated this game, so cooperation broke down everywhere. We also found that punishment affects behavior everywhere. It stabilizes cooperation everywhere, but at very, very different levels. People punish free riding behavior everywhere, and that's now the more interesting thing, everywhere equally. So the punishment of free riding behavior was not different between 43 different places, or only very minimally. So free riding behavior is disliked everywhere. Another very big difference was, how do people punish those who cooperate more than others? We call that antisocial punishment. That differs very much between places. And overall, when we look at the data, what produces these differences, it has a lot to do with beliefs of what others are doing. Yeah. So in societies that tend to be cooperative places, with the rule of law and lots of other levels of types of cooperation in these lab experiments is also higher than in dysfunctional societies. Yeah. Punishment is much more antisocial than in functional societies. So there's a lot of it is, again, I think you can discuss with my CRISP framework in the sense that we keep the incentives constant in this, so that the incentives per se are exactly the same across all these experiments. But what's different is what other people do and why. Yeah? And there is obviously an interaction. If you live in a society where there is lots of corruption and lots of dysfunctionality, and therefore probably also lots of little civic cooperation among citizens because they don't trust each other, in those societies, people are pessimistic about how cooperative their fellow citizens are going to be. And they cooperate less in our experiments. Yeah, so that's one answer to this. But again, I think we are planning a project about rule following, doing the same thing. So, but again, here I will be guided by the CRISP framework for this, because I think it's these four elements. It's beliefs, what others do is one thing that cultures affect. It's what norms do and all that stuff is what do other people do. Yeah, it's a fundamental thing. It's also, rules about what you have to do and how strong these are. Yeah, is quite different across places, I suppose. So, because I don't know how where this framework carries us to, but I like to try it. So yeah, because I think at the end of the day, the arsenal of human behavior psychology, from my reductionist, maybe simple-minded economist perspective, is not infinite. I mean, behavioral expressions are infinite, but already with my four elements, you can create lots of behavioral differences just by combinatorics. Yeah, of how things can combine with each other.
And in what degrees?
Degrees and stuff, yeah, exactly. So I think the behavior of other people is what do you expect other people to do in a similar situation is where cultural differences arise. Do as the Romans do, is a saying. So when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So yeah, when in Istanbul, do as the Istanbul people do. So this is just one.
Well, with any laboratory science, there's always a question about external validity.
Yes.
How well does this apply to the real world? And
yes.
If I could just put a personal note in here, I think this idea of, multiple factors with multiple levels operating in all of them is very promising with regard to external validity. But to what extent can we have an ambition to describe the external world?
Yes, okay. So I have two answers to this. So the question is how narrowly do you define external validity? I mean, that's the first part of my answer. The world consists of cooperation problems. So we study a cooperation problem. It's not a completely artificial thing to do. Yeah. Right. So there is some validity. I'm not a big fan of external validity. The concept, I don't like it very much. The reason why I don't like it very much is because it's the same human beings. They walk into the lab, they are there. An online experiment is not even 10 minutes. Yeah, it's these people who do stuff under incentives. We give them, so they do something. Of course, we control the situation, but it's okay. And then they walk out, and they're the same people. We don't change them in the experiment. So I don't know. But okay. If you think about external validity, I have two examples for this type of cooperation problem. So I did a study on, or we did a study on honesty, and in a simple experimental paradigm, the die roll paradigm, and we found that people were more honest in society with less cooperation, with less corruption. Yeah. So in society, there's lots of corruption. That is also a form of rule violations. Yeah. We call this prevalence of rule violations. There is more dishonesty. Yeah. My framework from today can explain this because if you see lots of people do what other people do, if you see lots of dishonesty around you, lots of rule breaking, why would you follow the rule? You think others don't do it because many people, they break the rules if others break the rules too. So that's why we expect it. Second consistent evidence consistent with external validity is that the cooperation that I just mentioned before in this cross-cultural cooperation project correlates surprisingly strongly with blood donations, how often people donate blood in a society, and with a very nice experiment, a natural experiment on lost wallet, return rates of lost wallets. So they lost wallets deliberately in places in a controlled and very smart way, and the return rates is one measure of cooperation. It's one measure of it's generalized cooperation because you don't know these people. It's you see a wallet and do you return it? Yeah. So it's a very smart experiment published in Science 2019 by Coleman, Marshall, and others. And so we took their data, which is obviously nothing to do with our experiment directly, but in societies where return rates were high, our cooperation were high too. The correlation is about 0.6. So yeah, it's pretty strong. So, and again, why is that plausible? I think from my model, at least, conditional cooperation and that beliefs what others do and how trustworthy people are in society. This is a belief that you bring into the lab. It's something you have experienced before you come to my experiment. You live in a society with your daily experience from 20 whatever years. And okay, now you see this experiment. Okay, do I think my fellow students or whoever, will they cooperate here in this situation? If you live in a society where trust and this type of civic cooperation experiences are high, you're more likely to believe that others will also cooperate here, as compared to when you live in a society where trust is low, civic cooperation is low. You think, who knows, I don't know these people. Overall, in my society, people don't seem to be very cooperative. There's lots of rule breaking. Therefore, my expectation is my fellow participants will not cooperate. Here, on average, they are right. Yeah? So that's at the level at which we have evidence so far about external validity.
Okay, I'm going to ask just one final question because we're running over time, but I can see that everybody's being very attentive. I want to ask you the hard question.
Okay.
What do we still have to do? What are the unsolved problems that you think are most feasible for morality researchers to focus on in the relatively near future?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I mean, I think we cannot change people. People are who they are, with their psychology and their inclinations. Sometimes you can change incentives, sometimes you cannot. Because people do what other people do, it's a very important phenomenon. So, I think a lot about this in the current political situation, what's happening in the world and so on. How do you slide into authoritarianism, for instance? Yeah, it's because people don't cooperate enough to prevent it. I think these are the hard questions, I think. Yeah. Why do people not cooperate enough here? Again, I'm selling my framework. I'm sorry. So it has to do with this type of motivations and how they play with each other. I don't have the answer to that. I mean, this research is only a few years old. The paper is half a year old. So the thinking behind it developed in its current form a couple of years later, so earlier. So I don't know the exact answer, but I think good behavioral models about what is happening, what motivates people, and how these things one thing is, these are 4 motivations that I presented that I think can organize quite a bit of things, but obviously they're also related. There are trade-offs, yeah? And the question is, where are they and what is happening there? So depending on some important situations is I think where future research should be going. Because I think, I don't know, with this, again, I with the caveat, I'm selling something here, so, and is that there's lots of literature that has demonstrated all of these elements, yeah, that they are important. So I think there is only one way to make progress. I don't have to think that my model is the ultimate answer to all of this, but something in this direction that acknowledges the existence of different motivations. Yeah, that seems to me the way forward to study these problems. And this doesn't have to take the exact form that I propose today, but something similar. That people are motivated by more than one thing. Economists were too simple-minded by saying it's all incentives. Yeah. But it's clear that incentives matter a lot, but what other people do matter a lot too, and incentives influence what other people do. Because people are also motivated what other people do, incentives and these other people are often, behavior of other people are often complementary. And so, if it, so these things can reinforce each other in a good and for good and bad. So, if nobody tries to speak up against the autocrats or the would-be autocrats, yeah, because they fear punishment, then nobody speaks up and they become self-reinforcing for reasons that we discussed. So, yeah, I mean, moral behavior, following moral rules. I mean, it has also, people in power the relevant people need to speak up for it, so that people doesn't. Because one problem of all of these bad things is that people think everybody agrees with these things. Yeah? It's pluralistic ignorance. To complicate matters, there's also pluralistic ignorance. I think, or I would be against it, but I think everybody's in favor of it. Yeah. So these type of things are the difficult problems. Like, I don't know. I couldn't give a more concrete answer to this, but it's probably.
Thank you. Well, maybe I would like to take the opportunity afforded by being the final speaker to say something that I think is sorely missing in most of the morality research. And I mentioned it in one of the questions I asked, which is the relation between subject and object. What kind of relational model, if I could use Fisk's term, are we in? Are we in a relation in that moment with that particular group or person, in which everyone is expected to help everyone else? Are we in a relationship where we're expected to obey, or where we're expected to give guidance or structure things for other people? Or are we in a competitive situation, or are we trying to share resources? All of these call perhaps for concretely different moral responses. And so I would say that integrating those kinds of ideas into morality studies would be a step forward.
Can I say something to this?
Sure.
So yeah, I agree with that, and obviously this is one of the shortcomings, or the shortcoming. We haven't discussed this yet. So I take a situation for given, a problem for given, and say, okay, these are in this situation. We study these behavioral motivations that can play out in this situation. But obviously, people try to structure situations, particularly those who are in power. Yeah. They try to let's say that's what's happening now in the world, is people in power try to restructure situations for us, that we are forced to play entirely different games. Yeah. So then, of course, we are in a different type of world. But it's not, again, I think it's still, they confront us with a situation that is now what it is. This, yeah, of course, let's say if we live in autocracy relative to democracy, it changes the relationship that people will have among themselves and with the authorities, their role, their expectations, again, what I think the toolbox that we talked about today, on this conceptual lens, can deal with these situations, I think. What it can't do, is how exactly these elements are play out with each other. That depends on the exact problem of the situation you're talking about. Yeah.
Not only politically, but I think in much more specific kinds of situations, using something like the CRISP model in combination with identification of the type of relationship would probably give us a more full understanding of what's going on.
Good idea, yeah.
There's a recent paper, 2022, identifying incentive types in Fiske's model. Fiske was one of the authors. It's a very nice paper, like trying to identify how different incentive types work in different relational models. There are some attempts to do that, I think.
Okay, when we're done, can you tell me the reference?
Yeah.
I would definitely send it to you.
Sure.
It's a really nice paper.
We are far over time. And so if anybody would like to make a closing statement, now's the time.
Thank you very much for the discussion. We learned many things, and maybe we can have questions now. And I would like to start first because I cannot wait to ask this. And I hope this is difficult enough. So, Simon, this is for you. You have a CRISP model. It's very comprehensive and very promising, I think. It works like a theoretical framework and shows us, where to look to understand rule following, cooperation, and many things. But to falsify CRISP, where should we focus? And if you want to develop this, how to do that? And can we add another element to CRISP? If so, how? Just like that. In other terms, if you wanna, can we make CRISP turn into crispy, for example?
Shall I say CRISP cannot be falsified? And the reason for this is it doesn't make exact behavioral predictions. It says which things will be important. Can be important. So the question now is, we might be in a situation like, maybe if you remember my talk, just to give the example, unconditional cooperation in cooperation problems. So unconditional behavior, that's not free riding, is quite unimportant there. Yeah. Unconditional rule following, however, is important. So some elements might be more or less important in this framework. I think the main purpose of it is not that it makes exact predictions. The theory is that, say, the thing that does make predictions is the element that I call the ABC. Once I know people's conditionality and the beliefs about others' behavior, I can predict their behavior. That works, and that can be falsified. Yeah. But the framework as such, it says we have these elements of things that people think about. You cannot falsify that. That's just a framework. You can say, well, in this situation, social preferences don't matter. Even they could matter, but they don't. In this behavior, unconditional behavior could matter, but it doesn't. In this behavior, other people's behavior could have a strong influence, but it doesn't have. So in that sense, yes. So, yeah, but generally, no. Of course, you can add elements to it, but I wonder what this other element would be that is not captured by one of these four elements. So the point is to keep it parsimonious. Maybe it's too parsimonious, and you tell me there is another dimension I have completely missed. Can it be something that's in addition to these things? Maybe there is, yeah. So that doesn't work about one of those channels.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for such a fruitful debate. So mine is just a basic assumption is that, well, in every cooperation setting, there is always a leverage, whether it is monetary or whether it's knowledge, even emotional level, even a perceptional level. There is always a leverage between two people or more people, whether it be the group size or anything. So, but in the experiments that we conduct, this leverage, we usually tend to first start with the peer-to-peer cooperation. But to my observation, this doesn't exist in the real world. And also touching to other points, this leverage is also very contextual, and it can also be defined by the relation between the object and the subject. And also, again, to tie to your rule following, this leverage is what makes rules legitimate and what makes them enforceable. So,
by the project that funded these niceties and some of the things that we heard today is called Behavioral Principles of Large-Scale Cooperation. So that's exactly what I'm after. So I thought these small-scale experiments are just a means to an end. I think I wouldn't take the small scale or the small groups here too literal, first thing, because the behavioral principles that they express and allow us to measure, they are scalable. However, it's still a good question. So we have done experiments with much larger groups, and the behavioral principles are the same as the small groups. So we can study behavioral principles in small groups and they scale to larger groups. That's my direct answer. But of course, I mean, this is why another reason why rules are such a thing. I say, okay, here's a rule. You're supposed to follow it. Have you followed it? Oh no. Okay, now you get your punishment. Yeah, when you don't follow the rules. So that's laws and rules and regulations are there to organize society. And if you don't follow it, maybe not always, of course, but at least in principle, there's a punishment that goes to you. So for that reason, we can study the principles that drive people's behaviors in small scalable things, because at the end, it's people will follow rules. If other people follow them, is an important reason for following rules. It's not perfect. For some people, you need incentives to do it. Yeah, because we can study these things. Yeah? So because the principles are similar. Yeah, of course. Again, how scalable are things, and what are differences? If people have to play by the same incentives, for some people, for instance, again, just an example. During COVID, there are lots of young people who said, why should I wear a mask or why should I get vaccinated? Or that doesn't matter, some groups in society, it will not affect me, so why should I do it? Yeah, it's because incentives affect people's behavior. And they say, oh, not in my interest to do it. I don't see a reason, so I don't want to do it. Yeah, so of course, there is heterogeneity. This has to do with some of the things that we discussed too, because cooperation problems are not exactly the same for everybody, partly because incentives differ for different people, so to make things complicated. But again, the behavioral principles are the same. You're more likely to follow rules if you think you are incentivized to do it. If you think, oh, it doesn't matter, there's still surprisingly strong rule compliance, but it's clearly lower than if you think you have a strong incentive to follow the rule. Yeah, so incentives always matter. Yeah, but other things matter too. So. And how exactly depends on the problem, depends on the situation. All we as behavioral scientists can provide is the conceptual and empirical tools to study these problems and these factors and how they interact for a situation of interest.
So my question is related to the cultural discussion, cultural variation. You emphasized what do other people do that could explain the cultural aspect. When it comes to rule following, especially unconditional rule following, from my perspective, it seems that if rule following became a social norm, then we might expect people to follow such norms, such rules unconditionally as well, because it will be internalized or intrinsic, as you mentioned. But in places, in cultures, especially where it didn't become a social norm, do you expect still to find unconditional rule following universally, regardless of cultural norms?
I would like to find that out, which is why I need to do this study. So I agree with that. Yeah, but let's say, what's interesting if you remember my talk, so even abstract rules that make no sense, once it's a rule, people say it's socially appropriate to follow it. So rules acquire normative significance pretty quickly, I would say, just because why that is, again, that's for psychological mechanisms or thing. Why do people think? Why do people think in an entirely abstract experiment? Yeah, where you should go left or right, and the rule says you go right. People say, oh, that's socially appropriate to follow that rule, and not to do it is inappropriate. Why is that? Yeah, I have no answer to that, but it's a good question. I think the unconditional rule following is at least as important as that phenomenon. So, but it also that phenomenon tells you that people internalize norms to the extent that people follow rules because it's a norm. It helps rule following, of course. Yeah. When you have even a senseless rule in a simple, stupid game, we give them a rule and say go left, and that becomes now normative. Yeah, becomes a norm. Yeah, that's the right thing to do. Now people say, okay, it's another reason to follow that rule. So of course, in reality, rules have normative significance for a substantive reason. So religious rules are like that. Yeah, they tell you have to believe that or do that because of scriptures and thinkings and I don't know. And to the other extent, for the true believers, it's not needed. It says, does not need it that other people follow the rule. It's just needed that I do my prayers and my rituals and my services and whatever, because that's the right thing to do for me, regardless of whether I live in a believer society or a non-believer society. I do that's unconditional compliance with, let's say, religious rules in this case. Yeah, so societies and people differ on this dimension, and there's extreme variety around all of this. That's interesting to study. Yeah, but my proposal is to make this manageable from a behavioral. I'm only talking behavioral scientists now. Yeah, behavioral mechanisms and principles, or maybe psychological mechanisms. We need to keep it manageably simple in terms of the basic primitives of such an explanation, and that's what we propose to do.
Thank you.
Pardon me. Yilmaz, do we have any more time or not?
Yeah, last two questions.
Okay. And my question would be the follow-up question to Ensar's question. So when I think about when people follow rules, they are most of the time when they are watched by other people or when they are observed. We talked about the punishment mechanism. So I also wondered, what about the reputational concerns? Would that be another factor in the model, or the combination of others, or maybe like extrinsic motivation?
In my incentives, if you do stuff that's outside of yourself because somebody's watching, yeah, or because I might lose my reputation or my standing, that's an extrinsic incentive. The extrinsic incentive is not a monetary punishment only. Yeah. The extrinsic incentives can be that somebody tells me off, and I feel like if I do that, they will look at me, or they will tell me off, or they will shout at me, or they do whatever. This is an incentive, even if it's not the case. It's an incentive not to do stuff. Yeah, I might also. What's interesting about one of these surprising findings to me was there is lots of rule following, and it's obvious in the experiment that nobody's watching. Nobody. It's completely anonymous. I have no idea who these people are. Yeah. Why is that? Because I can think about what other people would do here. Yeah. Although there is no punishment, of course, I think about what other people would do, and they would do this, so I do it too. So it's not. This is exactly, I think, one of the beauty for me. The beauty of this experiment is it cannot be explained by extrinsic incentives. Yeah. So it must be something else.
And I have also a question. So while I was listening to your speech, I think about Kahneman's dual process theory. So, there is reflection and intuition. And when someone uses their reflection so many times on specific topic, this reflection becomes now intuition. And this is called as smart intuition by donors. So I wonder, when someone use their rule following based on motivated by extrinsic reasons. And now this turns into a intrinsic rule following. So can we expect to see differences between pure unconditional rule following motivated by personality or temperament? Yeah, maybe there is a smart rule following mechanism. I don't know.
I don't know the answer to that question. So it's a good question about what are consequences of incentives. One possibility is that if you're forced to do stuff because of incentives, once incentives are falling away, you're actually cooperating or follow rules less than before. So there's sort of crowding out of. Of course, it's the other possibility exists too. So if you have internalized it, it's really good, and I change my mind, I internalize it, now I follow it without incentives. Yeah, but I think, at least in society, in practice, you need to internalize stuff. You defend democratic norms, for instance, something important now, because in and of itself, because it's the right thing to do, not because of incentives or not, or this or that. It's the right thing to do. This is why I call this R element, this respect for rules, are the right thing to do. It's an internalized, generic moral rule that does not depend, or should not depend, on what other people do. And to strengthen that type of intrinsic reasoning is part of what the democratic education is supposed to be, for instance. So incentives alone probably can do some work, but it's never complete substitutes for value-oriented, internalized moral rules of behavior.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your good questions.